Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another talk that I'm so happy to be recording. This one is with Mckenzie, who I have been following, whose work I've been following for 2 or 3 years. And I have wanted the opportunity to talk with you, Ian, for that whole length of time to really drop into your journey, your process around the healing of gender. And here you are. And I'm so happy that you're here. I'm so glad that you're a part of this symposium.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we'll say more about what you're doing and that journey and all of that in 1 second, but I just want to read your bio so people can have a sense of who you are. Yeah, Ian Mckenzie is a new paradigm artist who currently resides in the Comox Valley, Vancouver Island, with his partner and young son. For over 15 years, he's been tracking the global emergence of imaginal culture. From the desert of Burning Man to the heart of Occupy Wall Street, he has sought and amplified the voices of visionaries, artists, and activists who have been working toward planetary system change. He is also the host of the Mythic Masculine podcast and co-founder of the School of Mythop. And as we're about to talk about, you're in the process of putting together a film called about a community called Tamara. Yeah. And yeah, so your whole journey, the work that I'm familiar with is, precisely in line with the goals of this symposium. And here we go. I want to hear all about it.
Wonderful.
Please. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so is that over to you kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, yes, start where you want. I would love to hear. I know that you've gone in depth into the feminine, then you've gone in depth into the masculine, and now you're working on a project that is really about, I'll let you put it in your words, but I'm assuming healing of both together, which is exactly this. So
okay,
start where you want.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, Martha, and greetings to all of you tuning in. Yeah, I could say a little of, I guess, my work over the last 15 years has really been one of somewhat of a like mimetic amplifier is one way to say it. And by that, mimetic, the word meme, right, is generally used today to mean, kind of hilarious, social media post or something. Whereas, there's a deeper understanding of meme to mean a kind of an idea, right, or a frame or a story, right, something that can be passed or pollinated is one way I like to think about it. And so I discovered somewhat, a decade or so ago that I wanted to involve myself somewhat in, what felt like a clear recognition that we were in trouble, that, modern industrial society was certainly in trouble and driving headlong off a cliff and taking most of life with it.
Yep.
And, it might've been sort of early, it was around mid-20s or so, where certainly there was a period of disillusionment and a sense of, releasing any ideas of the story that I had been given and granted and grown up with, that it was worth pursuing. And I looked to what might engage the times in the most effective way. And for me, what I discovered really was film. Film as a way of, being a unique, alchemy of all, music, voice, images. And I felt like that film had the real power to transmit, in a really deep way, the possibility of shifting consciousness. And early on, I worked on a film with a friend of mine who actually had a similar disillusionment and wanted to head off on an exploration of what he wanted to do with his life. And he started, and I supported him in co-creating the 1 Week Job Project, which is what it became known, where he did one job a week for a year. And, he just put it out on the internet and he said, hey, I'll come work with you. I just want to explore different things. And people responded that it was wacky enough and interesting enough that people who love their job, really want to share it. And so he ended up being a dairy farmer in Alberta. He was a fashion buyer in New York City. He was an astronomer in Hawaii. all these places. You know, he could have gone for years, actually, the amount of jobs he got.
Wow.
But somewhere in there, I discovered, again, documentary in particular, I was really intrigued by. And so when I finished that film, I was stirred by another Canadian filmmaker named Velcro Ripper, who had done a film called Scared Sacred. And that film was really looking at what he called the ground zeros of the world. Like he went to New York after 9/11, to Bhopal, India, after that chemical accident, and really tried to understand like what was in the aftermath of these, horrendous events, and what was the possibility that lie within them to, again, to create change or to invoke change. And so he followed that film up with one called Scared Sacred, not Scared Sacred, Fierce Light, which looks at what was understood to be Gandhi's term for soul force, right? The sense of spirituality unified with activism.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, that became that film, beautiful film. And then he was working on a third film at the time. It was called Evolve Love, really, which was asking the question, what if we all became spiritual activists? And so I reached out and I said, hey, I'm a young guy and I love film and I wonder if I could, work with you. And he said, okay, well, we're going to the Alberta tar sands next week, find your way there. And sure. And so that's what I did. So that was the first shoot with him on that film, was flying over the Alberta tar sands, which have since become, somewhat of a, almost like a trope in a way for, climate destruction and ecosystem, destruction. Yet then it was still fairly new to the world scene to see these, vast fields of, stripped earth. And anyway, that whole journey culminated in going to Occupy Wall Street, which was happening around the time, where we, met with other, activists and philosophers and artists. And around that time, also I connected with Charles Eisenstein, who has since, his voice has certainly arisen, and he's shown up in lots of different venues. He wrote a book at the time called Sacred Economics.
Oh, wow.
Which is, I was stirred by that book so much that I said, hey, I'd just love to come film with you, because I wanted to make a short film about it. I knew it had to get out there. And he's like, okay, come see me. He lived in New York area. And so I did. And so anyway, we ended up on Wall Street, all this confluence of events. I released that film, Sacred Economics, as well. And I think it did what it was meant to do. It really to pollinate these core principles, this core mimetic idea that like a different economic system is possible, and that certain behaviors like greed and hoarding and exploitation, they're all natural outcomes of our current economic system.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily universal human behaviors, right? That's one thing to differentiate between those, because this also now begins to tend towards this exploration of gender as well, which is, after Occupy Love, I got really curious about this idea of the rise of the feminine, right? And more explicitly, I was at Burning Man, the Burning Man Festival, which I'd gone a number of times. And I experienced, there was this one female DJ who I saw who, was channeling something. Like I was really just intrigued by whatever she was doing with the music and the mixing. And, it was clear that it was just something different than what I typically experienced from, let's say, a male DJ. And that really just launched a whole inquiry into basically trying to reveal this surge or this rise of the feminine, which can feel very vague, right? Like, how does one really talk about it? And I assume at this conference, likely that a lot of people have talked about it, but unless it can be sort of made visible through the lives of actual people, and in this case, actual female DJs and producers, which is what we did, it becomes hard to grasp onto. And so that also launched my own sort of dive into the archetypal realm. I read Marianne Woodman, Dancing in the Flames, and really this sort of mythopoetic legacy, Women Who Run with Wolves, of course, all that stuff. I was really intrigued. So I was trying to understand, how do I make this film? How do I understand this, quote, rise of the feminine? And again, somewhere in there, I started to realize, oh, wait a second, I really have no idea about masculine. And, of course, I've grown up as I did, but I didn't have any similar sense of inquiry into masculine archetypes, the masculine journey. And it was around that time, this is about 2015, that I found the book Iron John, which was, already sort of hovering, and friends had talked about it. And but I found it in a study of my grandfather's after he died, when I was collecting up his things. So there's a whole kind of mythic synchronicity there.
Yeah.
But that launched me into, again, my curiosity into masculinity, which ultimately led to the launch of the podcast, the Mythic Masculine podcast, which I could get into a little bit after this. But essentially, it feels like exactly that. My curiosity into understanding, like, what's at the heart of the strife or the conflict, in the world. I mean, it sort of seems across the human species, really. And I've come to understand it as this breakdown between the relationship. I mean, you could say the masculine and feminine, you could say men and women, but essentially, there's an inability to really be in good relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Seems to be at the heart of it. And so ultimately, this inquiry into the two different genders, the gender sort of mythic substructure. Also, I was called to go to this community in Portugal called Tamara, which you named there. It's a research community that started in the 70s, really with this same question, like, where does peace come from? How can peace emerge on this planet? And they understood, as the founders, Dieter Doom, Sabine Lichtenfels, and Charlie Rainier, that it was to heal this rift between men and women. That's sort of in the core substructure, and they've done incredible research ever since. So that's a whole sketch of basically the last 15 or so years, in terms of my work, in terms of my inquiry. But maybe it's helpful to sort of lay that out before we dive deeper into any of them.
Yes, that is amazing, and I could ask you so many things. I mean, is there a next place you're already feeling called to go, or do you want me to ask a question? Where are you with it?
Well, my sense is, maybe I could share a little bit what I've gleaned from,
Cool.
that, for at least the initial inquiry into masculine, feminine, and also understanding that, yeah, these can be tricky terms that obviously in this day and age as well, in terms of, really what I would say the dissolution of gender, or the reimagining of gender, the personal identification with gender. I mean, all of these things are undergoing, some clear reformatting in a way. And it could be highly contentious, right? Depending on who's speaking, who they're speaking to. But I, at least for myself, is that I seem to want to recognize and seem to see evidence of that there is some kind of blueprint within, call it polarity, or the way that gender expresses through humans. And that though there is, countless iterations, countless unique iterations within that framework, that there seems to be these kind of coalesced polarities that maybe have different terms, yin and yang, masculine, feminine, men and women, but that, to me, that there's something valuable actually in being able to like intentionally speak about these things in this way, but also not lose the, what do they say, the map for the territory, right? That just because, basically, the danger of creating any kind of universalism is that you then kind of invite a response that's just another universal, which is what we see in the, I would call it like the gender wars in a way, right? Is it, on the one hand, is gender simply, is it innate, right? Is it biological? It's innate and, clearly self-evident, or is it totally socially constructed, all about power, power dynamics, and personal identification is actually what matters above all. You can just decide what your gender is, and that actually, that's a victory. That those seem to be like the two extreme poles, right? And within that, of course, gets lost, I think, again, the nuance, but also I would say the recognition that whenever I speak to, for example, Indigenous guests, for example, on my podcast, like the Mythic Masculine, oftentimes what happens is they say, well, this is what we do. Right? I don't think I've ever heard everybody should do this, right? Or this is how it is for everybody. They tend to say, well, this is what we do. And so for me, what's important, I think, to recognize is that any universalist conversation or ideas around what, quote, how men should be or how women should be, or whether they exist at all, has to at least start with the recognition that very likely there is no we to begin with. If you hear that, if you think about, even for example, like the US, or I'm in Canada as well, that, the whole thing called Americans, I mean, here's another funny story too. I was on a bus in Colombia. This is maybe 7 years ago. I was covering a cultural event, like one of their festivals. And I was on a bus with other journalists, most of them from Latin America. And I was one of the only Canadians. And I believe, and there may be American on there too. And again, you hear my language, an American, right? What I mean, a U.S. American.
Yep.
And so I was on the bus, and they said, "Where's everybody from?" And they said, "Oh, I'm from Mexico. I'm from Costa Rica." And then I said, maybe the guy said, "Yeah, I'm American." And of course they're like, "Hey, whoa, hey, what? We're all American. We're all Americans here.
Yep.
This is all American."
Mhm.
But again, this kind of universal idea that, well, what do you mean? That's the only America is U.S. Americans. But
Yep.
I say that to give an example that or even American, U.S. American, or even Canadians, right? It's a fiction. There's no such thing that is as intact a people as we could point to other longtime Indigenous peoples, right? Who actually have deep relationship to place. Because usually if we're talking about North America, maybe 500 years, right? Which is not a long time, according to intact Indigenous standards.
Yeah.
So it's not a long time to develop a shared sense of we that is actually bound by, again, like deep belonging and practices and rituals to place, that is actually like a call and response to place. And so again, I say that because largely it seems all the conversations on gender and universalist gender ideas don't come from a group of people that all know themselves to actually be a unified people. But they're trying to essentially assert their own understanding or their own universal on other people. And of course they resist that, and back and forth we go. So it's just important to, I think, recognize that if we're talking about North America at all, generally in these kinds of conversations, there is no we to refer to say we all think the same. And that's the poverty of essentially placelessness, right? So let's just say that. Now, at the same time, I do think it's useful to be able to talk about these things and to unpack them as we will, that there is something, in that I recognizably can say that seems or feels like an experience of the feminine, right? Or an encounter with the feminine, or
What specifically?
by that meaning there's times and experiences that I can have, right? For example, where let's say I might be at a festival and I see beautiful dancers dancing in a certain way, right? I might say, oh wow, that's a very powerful expression of the feminine. Or maybe somebody may say Shakti, or these kind of languages.
Yeah.
Just as I might say there's a very powerful expression, I see a male dancer, and I might see some powerful expression of what I would innately feel like, wow, that's a very powerful masculine expression. And I can't really rationalize it with like that, because it has all of these specific qualities, but something in me just feels true. It just feels like that's what I'm seeing, or that's what I'm experiencing, right? And so again, I just go back to, if we try to create a kind of artificial rationalization of there's gender, there's not gender, all these kind of things, it's like we're already getting away from the embodied experience of that, which to me, that's the helpful part, is only to recognize that there is something deeply embodied that's true, seems to be, in these kinds of conversations. So all I'll say is that was helpful in the journey into the feminine archetypes, and the project Amplify Her, which ultimately ended up being both essentially a platform for these particular women and for women in the scene to really be reflected in their power, that they do actually have specific creative power. In particular, what was a key thread was spoken by this one artist. Her name is Blondtron, or that's her artist. Samantha is her given name. But she says this line in the film where she says, I'm not allowed to be essentially like a high powering, businesswoman and a raunchy, sexy DJ that, talks about sex, and that in the world as it is, typically she's not allowed to be both. Right. And that split between creative sexual power and what you could say is a kind of, I don't know, masculine domination realm, I suppose, of business, is like those two aren't allowed to coexist. And certain places it's changing, but still there's quite a stigma, right, of a woman fully embodying her like creative sexual power. And I see that as clearly a rise of, quote, the feminine in a lot of contemporary discourse, is this reclamation, right, of this deep creative potency. So that to me was a huge thread of that particular expression. And then for the side of the masculine side, or the men's experience, for me, finding Iron John, which those of you who probably know, of course, is a sort of famous book by Robert Bly, passed last year. And it's sort of become a sort of foundational text for the mythopoetic men's movement, which included, or it still does. I mean, Michael Mead is still with us, but James Hillman as well, and Malidoma Some and others were all part of this movement. And largely what I tried to do with the podcast was sort of pick up the thread and unify, the previous generation with this one. But what I'd recommend, or what I found, I think, within the men's experience is that, there's something that could be called, the quest, right? Or the kind of the need to leave the village, or the need to prove oneself, or like this deep sense of needing, it's initiation is really the desire that I think a lot of men have to be gathered into a bigger story, right? A bigger story of meaning. And largely because there's no village anymore for so many of us, that there's a kind of like sending out, but there's no return, right? There's nowhere to return to. So you can almost think that men get in a kind of ever cycling feedback loop of trying to prove themselves through, the means that the culture wants them to continually try to prove themselves through domination or money or power, acquisition, the rest. And yet the deep longing is actually to come home, to belong again, right? To be received back, but there's nowhere to receive them back too. And so that's a kind of a heartbreaking recognition. I think that you see there's the boys inside are like where's the village to come back to? And it's nowhere. And so to me, that's like, again, one of the key substructures of this, all the thing about toxic masculinity and all this kind of stuff. To me, that's just surface stuff. Again, that's the surface battle that's going on, but it's this substructure that actually is what's, desperately needing to be tended to.
Beautiful. Yeah. So in my world, part of my story and part of why I'm holding this symposium is because 4 years ago, I was, starting in 1999, I was in social work, and I got my MSW and my master's in social work in 2001. And I did social work for the majority of 20 years, right? And then 4 years ago, I had this experience where essentially a group of spirits came to me and said I needed to start channeling a series of 8 books. And so that's a whole long story, of course, right? But it was a little bit shocking, and totally changed my life. So I ended up leaving social work almost exactly 3 years ago, actually. So about a year after that spirit thing happened. And so I channeled the first 3 books I channeled the first book a few months after that happened and published that. And then the next 2 and 3, the second and the third one, a year after that. And those 3 are like, they're out there and they exist. And they're a trio that help remind us that we are beings of the light, beings of the cosmos, beings of this planet. And they're like a little set that kind of go together. But then the second set of 3 is what I've been sitting with for the past 2 or 3 years, as I've gotten to, for example, hear your work and that kind of thing. And those 3 are called, so the first 3 are called Living the One Light, Gaia Speaks, and The Cosmos Speaks. So those are the 3 that are done. Then the 3 that I'm sitting with are called Love Speaks, The Goddesses Speak, and The Gods Speak. And again, this is channeled, right? This is not me coming up with these titles. Like I'm being told very directly what to do. And so Love Speaks, Goddesses Speak, and God Speak is about essentially remembering the infinite manifestations of the divine feminine in Goddesses Speak. And I've channeled the first draft of Goddesses Speak 2 years ago. I channeled that. I channeled also the first draft of Love Speaks, which is really about the two coming, the feminine and masculine coming together inside of ourselves, the inner sacred union, healing, that kind of thing. And then the parallels of that inner healing to every other healing that needs to happen on this planet. But God Speak, I haven't started. So I've channeled the first draft of Love Speaks and Goddesses Speak, and I haven't started God Speak because I think for me, I've needed to sit with and be with my own relationship to the masculine and to the divine masculine And I've needed to go through my own personal journey around all of it to a pretty large extent. And so now holding this, the symposium also is essentially in a way channeled, like it was told to me in a spiritual vision, like a lightning bolt coming through my body and the whole thing just in front of my eyes. So it's clearly connected to this set of 3 books that I'm supposed to channel. And part of what I sit with, like on the human Martha level, is, okay, cool. So my sense is that, us as spirit beings, because that's what I experienced, all of these spirits talking to me is really like us, just in a different form or whatever, right? There's a wisdom, I think, in fully exploring that the infant manifestations of the divine feminine, and separately also really delving into the positive divine masculine, whatever that is, and then bringing them together, right? And doing the healing between them, again, internally, and then in our world. So as I'm hearing you talking, I mean, it seems really parallel to that set of things I'm sitting with. And it reminds me of one of my big questions that I really just genuinely don't know the answer to. And this symposium is helping me process my own feelings about it. But I'd be curious what your take is on what the heck are we doing? Like, what is this? And what do you think is needed really ultimately, for our planet, for us as a whole human set of beings, for the animal, for all of life here on Earth, and just kind of in general in existence? It's a huge question, but
Question.
yeah. do you get the gist of what I'm getting at? Or do you need me to explain it in a different way?
I think I have enough to try something.
Okay, cool. Go for it.
I interviewed Charles Eisenstein for the podcast. Now, he had also gone on a journey. I believe he said the new story of masculinity, which he'd done, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And when I asked him a bit about that journey in my podcast, and also really what has emerged as this archetypal shift, which I believe may have initially also come from Joanna Macy, is this idea of this archetypal shift from Mother Earth to Lover Earth.
I love it. Oh my God, that's so beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, and I could share a little bit of my understanding of that, which is, if we, and again, so the caveat to all this as well is because the danger is, again, having any sort of universalist story about all of humanity, of course, right? Because there's lots of cultures, thankfully, who still exist and have certain cosmologies and the rest. But maybe it's still useful to consider, at least if we'd say the technological upsurge, let's say. And by that meaning, right, there seems to be a kind of decoupling of cultures that have remained somewhat in relationship to Earth. And if you've read things like, I believe it was Ishmael, right? Daniel Quinn has talked about this kind of thing where essentially that, there's lots of cultures that have actually decided at different points not to pursue like heavy technological advancement because perhaps they intuited that, whoa, this is a dangerous path, actually.
Yeah.
Because it sort of unleashes its own momentum, right? And we've also seen, of course, a number of empires that have crested and fallen again. And I'm sure at the time they thought themselves, last forever, but yet eventually, they fall too. And so now it seems we are in an unprecedented time where you could say that the technological machine, and there's writers like Paul Kingsnorth, who really writes articulately on this idea of the rise of the machine has really overtaken, almost every corner of the planet. And by that, sort of a machine intelligence or machine way, of which we are part of, but also seems in some ways strangely distinct from us, right? And the sort of positive projection of that intelligence is literally called artificial intelligence, right? And this whole idea that AI is actually superior to human intelligence, and there's those that are actually like, rooting for it, Ray Kurzweil and the rest. They're excited to, have humans upload their consciousness into the cloud, and
Oh my God.
essentially be biologically liberated, right? Is how they would say it, because
Ah!
the body in a sense is a flawed machine, is one
Mm.
way they might think about it. But you can see where
Oh.
that comes from, right?
Mm.
You can see where it comes from. It's
Misogyny?
essentially,
Misogyny
well,
among, oh my
well,
God.
the complete disavowal of essentially to be incarnate, right?
Right.
That because that is that which would die, right? And that's another kind of a shadow of the feminine, you could say, is that the feminine is both the giver and taker of life, right? And in a patriarchal system, and again, I always use that term a bit carefully, because I don't think it's actually accurate to what we're talking about. I think it's definitely used as shorthand to sort of mean, the domination by men of basically everybody. But I really like Rian Eisler's work, who talks about essentially, right, domination culture versus partnership culture. That's a much better frame.
Nice. Yes. Love.
She wrote, of course, Chalice and the Blade, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, which is where she articulated this. But I think it's really helpful to unpack it from that schematic, as opposed to just, oh, it's patriarchy, because there's ways in which domination culture has, and we all participate in it, well, the men and women and alike.
Yep.
So it kind of frees it from this idea, oh, it's men doing this, as opposed to, oh wow, we've been seduced by domination culture. And so I think from that lies a different possibility, which is, of course, coming back into partnership, coming back into contact. And so this, to me, is where the research of a place like Tamera in Portugal, again, where we've spent a number of years returning to make this film, where they've demonstrated really what I would call like a neo-European village, really, or a partnership culture, really, is what I see there, where they really put a high regard on essentially these qualities of what they call contact, remaining in contact, being in contact as an ongoing discipline. And at the same time, because they've been able to regenerate trust within their communal field in a really significant way, that allows them to actually explore a lot of other social forms, which are generally either taboo in the dominant culture, or very difficult to explore. For example, they're often sort of improperly regarded as a polyamorous community, but what's much more accurate to say that they're dedicated to love free from fear. That's what they say. And so what they found, though, is that when you create a social field where everyone's taken care of, in the sense of, they got food, they got shelter, companionship, these kind of things, and they're not something that has to be earned or bought. When those things are taken care of, then their relational dynamics within the community can just be as they are, right? They don't have to be everything else. They don't have to be a substitute for the village. They don't have to be, based on, will I be on the street or not if I don't stay in this relationship, right? Which so often happens. Yeah.
Survival. Yeah.
The survival, exactly. So when none of that's there, it can just be what they are, which is, to explore those from a much different place. And also they don't have any taboo around exploration of sexuality. They create places in the community specifically that are actually neutral. They call them love spaces, which is really beautiful, to basically just explore contact and whatever that looks like for folks to go outside of their own home environments, which is often where we create stories, right? You go into somebody's house, maybe you connect and you're like, oh, what would it look like to move in here? Like, what would my life be with this person? It's just easy to create stories, what they say, and they really are about this discipline of just pure contact. There's also a deep reverence for the sexual power of women within the community. And so, and the age, and for at any age actually as well. And so, there's women there that have been there, generation and a half now, well into their 60s, who enjoy deeply rich, sexual life in a myriad of ways, where, outside in this other culture, they'd say, I don't know, post 40, basically you're kind of irrelevant. So again, because they've been able to recreate that field of trust, of contact, of ritual, of like aligning with this deeper intelligence of Eros, which is how they speak of it. That's been able to largely tend to and heal this deep division. And they have this phrase, which is a sort of paraphrase, I think, of Dieter Doom, but also from one of their main people that live there, Lila Dreger, She says, there can be no peace on earth as long as there is war in love. And that's what they mean. And that's what they've really dedicated themselves to over the last 40 years. And that's what the film is really exploring.
Beautiful. That reminds me of two things. Well, yeah, what was it? 2 days ago, I got shown this vision of, what happened? Let's see. I was, okay. It's kind of, I'll shorten the story. Basically, I had this experience where I started to feel this huge amount of grief come up in my body. I had a conversation for this symposium actually with John, your business partner,
collaborator.
And what we ended up talking about in that talk was really about the deep grief of all of us on this planet, the planet itself, etc. And I had an experience where that I actually felt that grief in my body, in my womb, really. And I just started sobbing, like all out, like I couldn't stop crying. And I felt the parallel of my womb to the planet Earth, right? Of course. And so it's like this intense grief was, you know, who knows what I'm projecting, but whatever. My sense was like this sense that not only the planet Earth, but like all of life has a natural harmony and balance that is inherent to life. Like on the ultimate level, you know, stars and our sun, and which is a star, and the planets and all these things are in natural balance with each other and natural harmony with, like, physically, you know, physics would say that, physics would agree with that, right? So and it's in our relating on this planet as humans where our sense of harmony and balance gets disrupted. But the ultimate reality is this inherent harmony and balance. And so I had this whole, like, as I was sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, I had this vision. I was being shown the need, like the grief of quote unquote our planet or me or whatever, that we on this planet have gotten so out of whack that we actually think that sense of being broken or not in contact or not in connection or not in harmony, it's, first of all, it's so incorrect. It's just factually incorrect. And then second of all, it has created so much pain, you know, as we know. And so it was this feeling of like a calling in me to remember that full balance and harmony relationship that is natural to all of us. And specifically, what I was shown was like the natural harmony and balance between the energetic masculine and feminine. And again, not necessarily men and women, because I feel really strongly that this applies regardless of what gender identity a person has. And the whole non-binary reality is really, really important to me and very healing to me. But yeah, there was like this whole vision of the idea that like we have to come back, that I felt this imperative, like now, like you have to do it now, come back into this remembering of this harmony that is actually reality, you know. And it like felt like urgent, like do it. Anyway, that's what's coming up as you're talking. Yeah, and the other thing that was coming up was my 15-year-old identifies as non-binary, well, gender fluid, and pansexual, and he goes by any pronoun, so I'm just gonna use he, but he, they, she, all of it. At one point, he and I were talking about a year ago, when he first came out to me with his identity, and I said, you know, why do you think in your generation this whole non-binary thing is so present? And for me, I'm 45, so I'm 30 years older than him. For me, that was absolutely not a thing. Like, I realized when I was 17 that I considered myself bisexual then. Now I would say pansexual. But so sexual orientation was talked about, but gender identity absolutely was not, right? So I said, what do you think? Like, what's your perspective? Like, what's up with this? And he said, well, inside myself, meaning him, I don't feel a war between the masculine and feminine, but you do. And I was like, holy shit. What the heck? Oh my God. How is my 15-year-old saying this to me? How does my 15-year-old know that about me? How does my 15-year-old who has divorced parents, a man and a woman, not feel that war between genders? And oh my God, just like my overarching feeling was, oh my God. Yeah. So anyway, the whole thing is just fascinating to me. And, any reflections you want to have on any of that, go for it. But that's what was arising as you're talking.
Yeah. I mean, interested. I mean, I'm curious to hear more about, I mean, maybe not on this moment too, but it does intrigue me to hear how your son, you said,
Yeah.
would unpack that. Because, again, depending on, I mean, age can matter a lot, right? Life experience in terms of, having different relationships in the future or whatever, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But there's something in that, you're right, about some kind of like fusion or some kind of integration. Maybe, I would look on that as a positive projection there. It sounds like a story of integration.
Yeah.
And as far as gender as well, like, why is there such a proliferation of gender identities, the willingness to gender identities? I'd look also to social media, to be honest, and YouTube, and access that youth have to essentially perspectives that can proliferate right through these channels, and encourage a kind of questioning. Because I do think that there's work of Bill Plotkin, who does a lot of work with rites of passage, soul journey, and all that. But I believe his adolescence phase of the map of maturation involves, I think it's called Thespian at the Oasis, right? Something like that. But this whole idea is that it's a time of life when you're actually meant to try on lots of different identities, right? Lots of different looks. And I mean, of course, youth, I think any generation has been doing this, hairstyles and, dress and clothes, and, you're a goth and then next you're a punk, or, all this kind of stuff. That was certainly there for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's just some curiosity in me too around gender, again, is this sense of, is victory when one can self-declare their gender kind of above all else? Like, as in, is it what gets lost in that, in terms of, I don't know, ceremonial ways, like within a culture? And I go back to this again, right? This whole idea, there is no we. Because if you go to a peoples that are intact, and you might say, okay, well, what's a woman to you? They'd probably have a pretty clear answer. Oh, like this, this is a woman, this is a man. They probably have places for non-binary, for gender fluid. They say, oh yeah, they're this, they have this seat, in our way. But they wouldn't necessarily see it as combative either, right? Like, I think there's something, the way that I might say it is, based on something Stephen Jenkinson has said, who's one of my main teachers, not about gender, but he's talked about this idea of, I think it's related to work, but he used this metaphor. He says, if you approach a feast or a banquet, right? You don't approach the banquet as a problem for your stomach to solve, right? Probably not, right? You'd sit there and be like, oh, this is great. Like, I'll have some of this, I'll have some of this. Like, oh, and you just, you might enjoy it. You might relish in the taste and the flavor and all the rest. And I see a parallel with gender, actually, which is, so much of the discussion gender-wise, I think, in the culture at this moment, is that gender is a problem to solve, right? As opposed to, a banquet of expression and delight and other. And I get that obviously there's a lot of oppression and consequence to those that don't fit the gender binary, obviously, so I'm not dismissing that at all. But I also wonder, again, what gets lost in this swing to the other side, which is simply, you can decide what you are, and that's kind of it. But as in, where's the reflection from trusted community, from elders, from all these other ways that you might actually find your way there with some degree of, I don't want to say like challenge in a way, it's because it's not quite challenge, but it's like necessary reflection and maturation. And I think, at a young age, how do you really know that, right? How do you actually know that, when you're then 15, 14, or or even younger, right? When they say, oh, I'm this way, it's like, okay, try it on, and we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cool. Wonderful.
But I'd love to, I could circle back now, and I feel like, yeah, we're kind of edging our way to the close. Is that one, what's the promise, I think, of essentially being able to come back into contact, to dare I say, heal the gender war, right? And I think Tamara offers a picture of possibility, though, which is that when the energy that's spent in conflict is integrated enough that it frees up actually that eros, it frees up that capacity and resource, that then we have so much more energy to turn to actually what we need to be worried about, which is healing the destruction of the planet. And Tamara is a beautiful example of this, and a beautiful model, because they are also, not only are they recognized for their pretty radical research in their community, but they're also a world leader in regenerating the landscape, regenerating the earth. They built a number of lakes within their community there, which is in southern Portugal. It's a pretty dry area, which is then regenerated the lushness of that bioregion. And of course, all these animals have come back, and it's like this oasis right out there in the desert. And that shows, I think, again, it demonstrates that possibility, that in fact, if we were able to come back into a better relationship, we have so much more capacity to actually see, the existential threats that are upon us, instead of, losing ourselves in all these sort of surface conflicts that, just distract us actually from what needs to be done.
Right. And it what you're saying also fits that vision I was talking about that I had the other day, with needing to come back into this rhythm of life and the natural state of being that is us, that is all things, that is our literal connection with this planet that we're on, and then the planet's connection and our connection to absolutely everything else in existence. And it's all one flow. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
No, I just say, what comes to me is, I've been thinking about this word universe for a while, and it feels a bit monolithic, as opposed to something like polyverse, right? Which includes many, many songs, but in a certain coherence, in a certain harmony. And maybe I'll just leave it this image, actually, which is in Tamara, in the community, I attended one of their programs, which is called the Global Love School. So it's the idea is that they bring in all these activists from around the world, and artists, creatives, that they can experience essentially like a deep dive into their research on, particularly on this topic of love and sexuality, partnership, activism. And as part of the Love School, one year, we spent time separate in polarized camps, where the men went to one side, of the community out in the nature, and then the women went the other. So they had about 24 hours with each other. And I'll just say, for me, this is back in 2015. That was the first time I was in an intergenerational men's space.
Wow.
Where I just never experienced it before, where there was, multiple ages there. And what I'll just say was actually how beautiful it was, right? Just to connect in that way. And something felt fed in me, right? That I didn't realize. And I felt, again, that village nourishment, which I think is so much a part of intact cultures that, do this kind of thing. Clearly, it's just a natural rhythm of the community. But I'll say, when we came back together in this love school, they have a beautiful stone circle, which is it's sort of a Neolithic technology, you could say, really, but it's all of these gorgeous stones that have been placed in this plateau, all with different carvings that were channeled actually by the co-founder named Sabine Lichtenfels. And in this sort of really like a reunion ritual between the two camps, how we did it was, the men came up the hill, is because at the top of this hill, and as we approached the hill, they taught us a song actually that we would sing. And so as we were approaching, then the men would sing their part of the song. We'd sing all together and kind of, lob it over the hill vocally. And then, we'd kind of listen, and then we'd hear this response from the women on the other side of the hill. And so we started gathering, some momentum of the approach. And we eventually, while singing back to each other, back and forth, we met up in the stone circle. And in this case, to behold as a one that was in the men's polarity, you could say, in my own experience as a man, to behold women not as any particular woman, but just women, to behold them in that way was incredible. It was majestic, just to, in all ages too, right? It was all in all different everything, but it was just wow, like just to the awe was palpable. And in this case, they invited us actually to go, and we had flowers actually that we'd collected, and so we just offered up flowers, right, to these women of all ages, and they just received, and it was like such a beautiful, pure moment of reconnecting that relationship
Mm.
that felt very transpersonal, right? It wasn't about any particular me or any particular them. It was just these polarities that coming back together and celebrating and honoring each other. And it was just so healing. It felt, I mean, for me, for others there, that was profound. That so much of this banter, so much of this conflict that we argue about or try to fix, or it's like there's something actually deeper that just wants to be embodied and expressed. And ritual actually is often the best way to do it.
Beautiful. Yeah, right. Yeah, and then that, when I'm imagining that, it feels beautiful, and I also feel like then a need to do that inside, like I could imagine various versions of that where one could feel incredibly deep and meaningful and genuine, and another, I could imagine another version, obviously not what you experienced, but that could feel superficial and kind of like bypassing the real issues, like let's say there's these people coming together, have all kinds of conflict and toxic stuff going on, and then they like sort of pretend to be happy and nice. I'm not saying that at all, that that's what's going on in that group, but I'm just noticing in my body, like that, yes, that feels so beautiful, and a draw inside me to do that in myself, so that when I'm then coming to that kind of a ceremony, that I feel like I'm bringing the deepest part of myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I might suggest a yes and in that sense
Okay.
that, oftentimes I think we over process things in this culture, which actually typically is ritually bereft, and
Mm,
how often, this idea, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe I have to be in full authenticity or something before I can participate. But in fact, it's the participation which kind of draws forth, oh, I'm kind of spinning out on things that actually are best served in ritual. Like that's why ritual intelligence in intact cultures is so much a part of that, right? And why not having those spaces, often we're missing out actually on recognizing that, there's a place for processing, there's a place for, that kind of um, work, but that there is a massive alchemy that happens in ritual, which
absolutely.
done well, obviously done
Yeah.
well. Yes, it can be cheesy, it can be superficial, the ones that aren't done well, but when it's done well and well held, it can
Yes.
actually kind of not bypass, but just give a proper seat for all the other things that need to be worked on or incongruent, whatever. But it's like
Absolutely.
it can feed the deepest longing, actually, which I think is below all that.
Yes. I can. Yes. Yes. I feel all that when you're saying it. Definitely. Beautiful. Wonderful.
Okay, well, how's that feel? We should call
That
it for
feels
today.
great. Can I ask you one last question to sort of
Hmm.
top it off? Um, when you feel into your journey and your future, and I don't want to say necessarily the rest of your life, but like your goals for your place on this planet and your work in the world, uh, what comes up for you in terms of your ultimate goal? Like, what's your vision for the impact you're having in the world, or who you are?
Yeah,
Again,
also a
really
big question.
tiny question.
Well, I might just use this as an opportunity to speak to the School of Mythopoetics,
Yeah.
which is essentially it's recently launched. You mentioned my other collaborator, John Woolstone. For me, this is the culmination of so much of my inquiry over the last 15 years, that recognizing, people can watch a film, they can listen to a podcast, they can, have experiences, but unless they have somewhere to return, to integrate, to reflect upon with others, that it's just hard to integrate, right? It's like people are inundated with a lot of information, and to move it into an actual practice and in a community, in this case an online community, still felt really vital to actually have a chance again, like to really make some kind of shift, both personally and collectively. So for me, stewarding the launch of the school and where it may go is, yeah, I'm finding a deep satisfaction in recognizing I feel like this is something worthwhile, and yeah, something that can persist, beyond my efforts on, say, yeah, any individual film or any individual anything. So
Yes.
I'll say, yeah, if people are interested in all this stuff where we've been speaking to here, to go check it out, schoolofmythopoetics.com.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. I'm excited to keep following what you're doing and see this movie. And
Coming this fall, thesacredmatrix.com is
Sacred.
where people can find more. Thesacredmatrix.com. Yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Ian.